So good morning, and thank you to Applause for having me. So what we're going to do, there, it's working, excellent, is talk a little bit about the future of experiences, and then I'm going to spend most of my time talking about what it takes to deliver these experiences, and then we're going to have a panel of Applause customers come up on stage and talk a little bit about the testing. So we're going to get into the how do you do it here very quickly over the next, I think, hour and 15 minutes. So the critical success factors in today's digital experiences. I'm going to start. I actually don't have any animation, but I do like to take photos, so I'll use a travel example here. So what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about where today's experiences are, where they're going, and why it's so hard to build and deliver those experiences today. So in this example, figure out where to stand over a little bit here. So in this scenario, I needed to get to Sydney. So as a typical consumer, if I need to get something done, I start thinking and start sequencing all the things I have to do in my head to get done whatever it is I need to do, like get to Sydney. I need a flight, I need to get a seat, I need to get to the airport, I eventually need to get to a hotel. So in my head, I start thinking about all the things that I need to do, state of digital experiences today. And then I start thinking about all the apps and all the websites that I would need to visit to get this stuff done. And then I start thinking about all the inputs and all the outputs and the sequencing that needs to happen to get this stuff done to get me to Sydney. All right? So today's digital experiences, whether they're online or on mobile devices or could be anywhere else, it could be on your Echo at home, put most of the cognitive load on the consumer today. This is how you treat your consumers. You essentially kind of expose your mainframe systems up to your consumers, and you make them work their way through the system. If we look into the near future and what leading edge companies are doing today, and I take the same scenario of I need to get to Sydney, what I can do is simply express my needs in my natural language, which is English, to some kind of a virtual assistant. It could be a standalone device, it could be on my smartphone, which is the case of where most consumers are using voice assistants today, and I can simply express in my natural language things like, do I need a visa? How am I going to get to my hotel? I need a ticket. And then my smartphone here plays a bit of a different role because it's more of what I would call like an orchestrator of these experiences or a control tower. So simply by expressing what I need in English, my smartphone then or my virtual assistant will then assemble all of the services that I need on my behalf to get the stuff done that I need in order for me to be able to get to Sydney, right? This is what I would call the near future and the types of experiences that leading edge companies are delivering today. And then finally, as we look into what I would call the far future, either this virtual assistant or intelligent agent that acts on my behalf with all of the technologies that Gerd described, kind of like circling in the background, I simply will say, hey, I need to get to Sydney, or it'll know that, and without going through all these steps, it'll simply happen and I'm there. So to summarize the state of digital experiences today, if we look at where we are today, as a consumer, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in my head. Then I translate that into services and inputs and outputs and so forth that I need in order to get the action. In the very near future, we'll simply express what we need in natural language. It will happen, and then eventually, things will just happen on our behalf. But if we look at where leading edge companies are today, they're executing at this middle layer, but most companies aren't. And they're not executing at that layer because they've simply built what I call the wrong machine to compete. If we look at what I'd call the digital or the mobile experience delivery operations inside of most companies today, it's what I would call, it's very akin to a container ship. It's over in Singapore, it loads up with a bunch of containers, it sets a latitude, longitude for San Francisco, and it sets sail, and a number of weeks or months later, it arrives in San Francisco, unloads, loads up again, and sets off on a long journey, right? But we all know that doesn't work today. What works is more akin to having speedboats, where these boats can maneuver and shift and change speeds and change directions based on technologies and what's happening in the market. And if you think just about how quickly, let's say, consumer expectations are changing, it wasn't honestly that inconvenient to walk into a Starbucks and speak to a human being to order your coffee 3-4 years ago, right? Now that's highly inconvenient, like, oh my God, speak to a human. 40% of Americans find it inconvenient to get their purse or their wallet or their phone out to pay for something, okay? So now we want to pay for things with our watch, right? Consumer expectations are changing very quickly, and then the technology is also changing very quickly. Just last year we saw the introduction of instant apps, progressive web apps, chatbots on Facebook Messenger, and so the opportunities and the places that you need to engage your consumers is also changing very quickly. So there's a lot of reasons for this. And if we look at companies that are executing well today, most of them are what I would call like mobile-only companies or mobile product companies. This is one of my favorite. It's from a company called Lark. They started out as a sleep wearable, and then around 2012 switched over to a coaching service, and they've since analyzed billions of data points to provide coaching around health and fitness to consumers, and have had lots of conversations with consumers to drive traction. And if you ask, somebody actually said to me once, like, why do you use yourself in your photos? It's so I don't have to pay copyright fees. So it's not that I'm into like photos of myself, it's just easier when you're giving presentations. Put that disclaimer out there. But they're not just mobile companies. This is an example from a company called Macquarie Bank out of Sydney, and I had the opportunity to talk to their CTO, Louise, and this is another company that's really thinking about, well, how do we deliver experiences to consumers in their natural language? And they've created an app. In this case, their banking app is very targeted around helping people save money, file expenses, and so forth. So it's not just companies with purely mobile products, but leading edge companies are also delivering their mobile apps and websites in natural language, even if it isn't a conversation yet. So you may ask yourself then, well, what do these companies have in common? And what they have in common for the most part is what they were born mobile. They were fundamentally born with a different DNA, so a different plan for the evolution, the growth, and the development of themselves as an organism. And well, I would tell you, as an analyst, I don't know, I've been an analyst almost 20 years. I've spoken to hundreds and hundreds of mobile companies. What we did in this case is we spoke to companies that have mobile as a product, and we talked to them less about the end game and more about how they were executing on a day-to-day basis to really understand how they're operating in an environment that's moving as quickly as today's environment is, and to really understand their operational best practices. And there were 7 key things that stood out. So the first one is they really value what we call customer obsession. I know Forrester and a lot of companies have been talking about customer obsession for a number of years, and you may say, well, what does that even mean when we talk about that in the context of a digital or mobile experience? And what we mean is you really have to get at serving your customers' pain points. So when Louise came on, and this was a well-established bank, but the retail banking part of it was new towards the end of 2015, is they sat down and they talked to consumers, and this is a bank. So as you can imagine, when they were talking to consumers and asking them about what their needs are, what motivates them, there was no consumer who said, what I really want is a daily account balance. I want a monthly statement. I want a 40-page PDF at the end of the month, detailing what all my stocks have been doing, right? That's not the kind of language consumers use. What consumers say is, I need to file expenses, I need to save money, I need to stay within a budget. So they built an experience that creates that experience directly for consumers in that language. And I think one of the most compelling things that we said during this interview is we're delivering experiences, not products. We're not exposing what our mainframe delivers to a screen. And if you sit back and you think about it for a moment, and you think about a lot of the websites that you use, this is exactly what companies are doing today, and this is what it means to put the cognitive load onto your customers. The second thing that came out is these born mobile companies told us you really need to build flexible organizations with cross-functional teams. I think all of us know, best practices today are to have agile Scrum teams with developers. But when you're talking about using natural language and having conversations with your consumers, just having developers that can, do a lot of logic isn't enough. You need a different kind of a talent on these teams that now includes things like AI, data scientists, machine learning, and more that literally sit on these agile teams. And then if you work in an environment, depending on the size of the environment, things like program management, product management, QA, we'll talk about more in DevOps, tend to be shared. And then if you work in a kind of a more traditional Fortune 500 company, certainly one of the things that you need is design thinking, because the impact of mobile casts a very long shadow. right? We're not just purely talking about digital services or digital or mobile as a channel. Mobile's fundamentally changing the way your customers engage with you, how your employees work, the layout of your physical spaces, and more. And somebody has to be thinking about the downstream implications of mobile experiences very early on in the process. One of my favorite quotes from this came from a gentleman named Gannon Hall, from the Chief Product Officer of Spring, who said, to accomplish relevancy or hyper-personalization with velocity, which is demanded by consumers today, we use agile scrums that include both developers and data scientists. And I would tell you, I talk to a lot of executives in Fortune 500 companies and small companies each year. We do a lot of surveys. Very few have this kind of talent inside of their agile teams, if they're doing agile at all. The third thing is you have to test and learn with velocity to drive innovation. I talk to hundreds of our clients each year, and one of the main challenges they come to me with is, yeah, my executives want an app. My executives want a chatbot, right? There's somebody in the room who's got a very loud voice saying, I want X, go build X. But in today's environment, where you also have so much feedback, is you really have to be in more of a, what I would call a data-driven decision-making process, where you develop hypotheses, you build, you create consumer-centric KPIs, test, watch the KPIs, adjust, and learn. There were so many interviews that we did. I remember one with the CMO of Grubhub, who said, and even for a very tech-savvy company like Grubhub, who was born digital and is primarily a mobile business today, there were so many things that we placed money, we placed our bets. We were so sure that we were right, and then we tested and we couldn't have been more wrong, right? Folks are wrong a lot of the time. And certainly, do so with velocity. And a different quote that I like that also came out of Spring, and this was from Scott, their chief of staff, that said, with a hyper-focus, you have to really be willing to course correct, right? This is about data-driven decision-making and not just the loudest guy in the room saying, we're going to do this. So the ability to make a mistake, recognize the mistake, and course correct, and do this really, really fast is key to our success, right? So velocity is another key theme that came out of the research I did, which you've heard a lot about this morning. You have to embrace a learning culture. Fundamentally, if you're going to be agile, if you're going to test hypotheses, you're going to be wrong. I was doing an interview with one of the lead product managers from Expedia, and this is a guy that's probably got more than 20 years experience with product management, and one of the things he said is, if you're a great product manager, you're probably right a third of the time, wrong a third of the time, and you're somewhere in between the other third of the time. So actually their CEO even sits in on monthly meetings where they look at the results of the hypotheses they're testing, and everybody's on board with the process of how they move forward. Because if you're going to embrace the learning culture, right, you also have to tolerate the failure that comes with that, because that's probably going to happen about a third of the time. And I would tell you, at least at Forrester Research, I've never heard my CEO say this, but this came from Ben Jacobs, who's the founder of Whistle. It's a pedometer for dogs. You guys are in San Francisco, so probably lots of your friends have pedometers on their dogs. And you may say, well, okay, whatever, what's the big deal? But this, 20-something sold his company for $100 million, right? He knows what he's doing. And, the quote that he gave us was, I'm afraid we don't fail often enough, right? We're just not really pushing the boundaries a lot. One of my favorites. All right, next on the list is you can't skimp on what we would call high-powered talent. You probably don't have the resources of talent that you need today to deliver today's digital experiences, let alone future digital experiences, because technology is changing so fast, and the talent that you need is very scarce and it's very expensive. So what you need to think about doing is hiring people who can learn very fast. They're flexible, they buy into the vision of your company, right? You can't typically, very few people will come to work for you just for money, right? They have to believe in what you're doing. And so if you live here in Silicon Valley, I don't know if there's anybody from Facebook in the audience, and you're like, Facebook, and you're Mark Zuckerberg, you can go personally recruit that talent and take them hiking and offer them, a compensation package that looks more like an NFL player or a baseball player would earn in a given year. But most of you aren't in the position to do that, so you really need to think about, finding people who can learn quickly, buy into your vision, are willing to be team players. Because even at the low end of getting a developer that's right out of college without any experience, those salaries tend to be about 6 figures. And then if you look at something that's more oriented towards AI or machine learning, those price tags are closer to $300,000 just out of school. not a lot of organizations are structured to accommodate that kind of flexibility. And so when we talk about don't skimp on high-powered talent, this is from Bill. He runs a company called Braze out of New York, but he said, we hire for mental agility. When you're constantly using new technologies, you can't find experience, so we really place a premium on people who can learn quickly. And for those of you, especially who are thinking about more conversational interfaces today, machine learning and artificial intelligence, you're probably experiencing this pain just like you did with mobile developers 8, 9, 10 years ago. You have to own and build core services in-house, but you have to license where you need speed, right? None of us could be moving as quickly as we are without cloud, without licensing platforms, working with companies like Applause. So, one of the core tenets here is certainly build what you need to build in-house to be competitive. That's your secret sauce, but leverage and tap into the technologies and the services that are available to you. And I'm not going to go backwards, but one of the things you have to think about with what we call a four-tier architecture is we talk about how fast technology is changing. The number of touch points in digital places or mobile places, it's almost irrelevant to call them digital or mobile because everything's fundamentally an experience these days, is going to continue to proliferate, right? You can't continue to build one technology silo after the other to support digital. Now there's email, now there's social, now there's mobile, now there's conversations, now there's voice, now there's this, now there's that. That's unsustainable, right? You need one common platform with data and aggregation and services that's capable of serving a lot of touch points as we look forward, or you won't be able to move with the velocity of your competitors. And this also comes from Ben Jacobs at Whistle. For pace of iteration, you can't outsource your core software and have the results in the timeline that matters. And then finally, one of the seventh of these DNA principles that came from these companies, born mobile, that's one of my favorite, is from a company called Life360. They've got more than 100 million downloads. I don't know if anybody uses it, but you can essentially track where your family members are. You may consider that to be creepy. I find it essential to know where my husband is. He's not one of those guys that's always on his phone. And when we talk about having customer-centric metrics, again, we do a lot of work with our clients year in and year out, and we talk to them, well, how are you thinking about your success? And they'll say, well, we're looking at the number of app downloads, we're looking at the frequency of engagement, like how many people come through the purchase funnel. Some folks move on to financial metrics. Well, how much revenue are we generating? Are we saving money? What's our conversion rate? What's the basket size? If I'm an airline, am I selling ancillary services and generating revenue? But I'll tell you what, none of these things matter to your customer, right? So when we talk about something that's customer-centric, it's got to be something that matters to your customer. And what I like about Life360 is philosophically, they believe that if a customer has to open their app, they've failed. Because they've failed to anticipate what the customer needs in that moment and to proactively push out that information, or in this case saying, James has arrived at home. John has arrived at school. That information that we need day to day. Oh, I guess I blew the punchline here, but this is from Chris, the founder of Life360, who again said, if somebody has to open our app, we've failed to anticipate what our customer needs and push out that information proactively. So one of the things I've showed you, right, we've gone out, we've talked to a lot of companies that are moving with very, very high velocity and also building the next generation of experiences to understand what those operational best practices are, but most of you were not born mobile. Right? There's a lot of Fortune 500, Global 1000 companies out there that also want to make this shift, but they don't have the benefit of just starting from scratch. So in addition to the research they did around the born mobile companies, is we also went out and spoke to 3 to 4 dozen SVPs of digital, CMOs, CIOs at Fortune 500 companies, and the leaders in that space when it comes to delivering phenomenal mobile experiences to ask them, well, how are you getting it done? And there's 6 ideas that came out of that research that I will share with you. So one is you really need to get buy-in and commitment from your C-level leadership. And if we think about what that means, one of the first elements of that is you need to recruit a lot of, well, I should say more than half of the successful companies with which we spoke recruit senior talent from outside the organization. So they get a chief digital officer or an SVP of digital externally because those folks have more autonomy and they make that a condition of their employment, right? And there's a lot that goes around that, but almost across the board, when somebody's having a lot of success, they've somehow found a way to completely make a break from like history, how we've done things in the past, using the platforms that are already in place, and creating change like this has to be that dramatic. And then the second thing is they really actively engage in the change process, relying on data-driven decisions. I won't go too far into that because that's one of the principles that came out of Born Mobile, but a lot, I would say, I hate to say to senior executives pride themselves on like having a vision and just saying, let's go do X. Let's go build an app, let's have a chatbot, and you really need your senior team to adopt that discipline of testing hypotheses and using a data-driven approach and being very agile and iterative in that way. And this is from the Chief Digital Officer of CVS Healthcare, Caremark, sorry. You have to look at what builds confidence with decision makers, ensure you nail momentum overwhelmingly to things that are very meaningful early on. This is how you get momentum and win over those senior executives very early. So as a follow-on to that, we talk about building momentum with small wins essential to your customers and essential to your business. So and I'll just roll both of these out here because we've talked a little bit about consumers, but you really have to understand your customers. I sound like a broken record, but the number of clients that call in and need coaching because a senior executive has said, we want to build X, it's unbelievable, right? You have to really, by starting with your customers and being an advocate of your customer, it really forces a discipline of like, what devices do my customer use, what services they use, what are their pain points? Because I tell you what, you're not gonna get any business results if you don't fundamentally deliver some kind of value to your consumers and you start there. And while you need to balance those things over time, you really need to start with what matters to your customers. Communicate with everyone, not just digital leaders early and often. One of the things you have to keep in mind is you really need to build bridges throughout the organization. Digital and mobile, it doesn't live in a bubble today. You can't just build a mobile app and have that be some kind of a standalone thing. You know, if we think just about retail, for example, last year in the United States, consumers spent about $60 to $70 billion on their mobile phones, but mobile influenced more than $1.2 trillion in sales, right? The benefits that you get of mobile aren't what comes out of a digital channel, it's the impact and how you deliver experiences and services to your customers across the entire ecosystem. Fundamentally, human beings are afraid of change, so you need to make them comfortable, especially with things that they don't understand, and really communicate a lot. You need to turn to design thinking to plan for the future and the impact of digital. Again, this is about, if you think about the Starbucks example for a moment, they couldn't just go build a mobile app. They had to change equipment in stores, layouts in stores, the height of shelves in stores. They had to change how they train people, the work processes that are in those shops, right? A lot has to change, and somebody has to think about that early on. I don't want to discount the challenges of delivering great experiences and the role that technology plays in that, but mobile and being successful with mobile is more about your strength and the skill set that you have around change management than it is just like, hey, can we build a mobile app and get it out in the store? There's a lot more to it these days. And so you also have to think about how you're accountable to everyone early on. If you're driving results, if you're spending people's money well, they'll trust you with the rest, and really listen a lot. This came up in a lot of interviews, but there was nobody who said, I wish I'd listened less, right? Spend a lot of time listening. Change is hard for folks. Next on the list, fourth, change how your organization views mobile or technology. Mobile's not a thing, it's not a channel, it's not some like itsy bitsy version of what's on the desktop, and the watch isn't some like, and the watch isn't about taking something on mobile phone and putting it in the dryer again and shrinking it one more time and getting it onto a small device. Mobile is fundamentally changing what's possible within your business, how you generate revenue, how you augment your staff's ability. It's mobile and everything that goes with it, like the voice and the sensors and all the bits are fundamentally changing how all of our companies operate. So don't treat it as a project, don't treat it as a channel, and really think about how you're going to persevere to build strategies and just not one-off channel experiences, and how you integrate this into your broader business. And this is from Josh, who is at Hilton Hotels, who, again, another one of my favorite quotes, persevere with building a strategy. It takes some wins to get the organization behind you, but it's worth it in the long run, right? So don't go off and do projects and one-off things. Drive operational changes across staffing, culture, and process. We talked about some of the operational best practices that came out of the born mobile companies, right? And so there's a lot of things you think about that are on your list. I have to change my culture, I have to change my processes, we have to be agile, I need different talent. All of these things are on your list, but then the question that comes back to us is, well, where do I start? Like, what do I do first? And what you need to do first is get the right talent, right? You need talent that learns fast, and the talent that you need early on that can sprint and run fast and be visionary is also different from the talent that you need to keep this going over time. And this is from KLM over in Europe, but it is completely impossible, right, to think or design of the ultimate CX and try to map it. By the time you have it developed, right, the puck has already moved. Having great operations isn't about, again, a one-time delivery or projects. I would tell you very seldom if a client comes to me and they say, well, will you benchmark my competitors? Will you do a competitive assessment? I refuse to do it for them around what features or functionality or services on an existing mobile app or a website. I won't do it because I don't think it matters. I think whether or not you're going to be competitive has a lot more to do with your internal operational best practices and how quickly you can move, and not whether or not you're at feature parity with one of your competitors, right? It's about how fast you can move. And then finally, challenge the status quo to drive collaboration with technology teams. I've been an engineer in the past. I'm on the business side now. Both sides have bad habits, right? You've probably all dealt with business people trying to bypass the technology team, saying the technology team doesn't move fast enough, they don't get it, they're too expensive, fundamentally they're too slow, and the technology team's like, well, if you had to keep the lights on and if you had to deal with like security and cost and maintaining all this code, you wouldn't move that fast either. But what you really need to do is get these guys on the same page and use what we call a two-in-the-box model, where both your Scrum Master and your product manager have a common set of goals and are working at a very localized level to resolve conflict, and it's not an us versus them thing when it comes to teams. And then finally, again, last quote from Spring is, you really have to be, I think I did this one already, so I'm going to pass over that one. So with that, I'm going to say thank you, and let's get the panel going.